We have asked the question whether Georgia, whether Russia, a lot of questions about various countries, where they're going. I think it's fair to say there are a lot of questions about where my country's going. Where's the United States headed? We have a great panel to discuss this, and moderating is my very good friend from Florida International University, Pedro Botta.
Thank you, David. It's a great honor to be here. I'm so grateful for the invitation by the organizers and very grateful for these amazing 2 days that we've had. So really, my hat's off to Nito and your team. I think it's fair to say that this final panel of the conference has been very greatly anticipated. People have been asking me about it, and I say to them, I'm not the subject matter expert. You'll have to wait for the panel and these brilliant minds that are here with us now. Whether the United States, many of us have been asking that question for a long time. And now we have an opportunity to reflect on that with the folks on the stage. Let me introduce to my far left, Evelyn Farkas from the McCain Institute and one of our hosts in Tbilisi. Next to me, Bill Taylor with the US Institute of Peace. On my right, Daniel Baer with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And to his right, Randy Scheunemann from the Halifax International Security Forum. I'd like to approach the conversation in two parts, if I may. First, let's consider the current state of US domestic politics in the context of an American society that is still quite polarized, with midterm elections very quickly approaching. Next, I'd like to explore how the domestic front will impact US foreign policy and the ability of the United States to remain a central player in global affairs in the context of the current conflict in Ukraine, of course, but also in the context of the potential advent of a multipolar world of great power competition. So I'd like to begin first with Evelyn, Randy, and Dan. And I'm asking you to pull out your favorite divination tool, okay? Bill, I will ask you in the second half to lead that conversation.
Prepared to wait.
Okay. So here, a quote from Jeff Greenfield from a recent piece in Politico. In November, American voters could send a small army of new Republicans to Congress, putting a brick wall in front of the Biden agenda. But they may not. And if they don't, the Democratic president could spend the next 2 years shaping the country with a small, battle-scarred, but ambitious majority. So, Evelyn, Dan, and Randy, what are your predictions for the midterm elections? And what will the domestic political landscape look like as a result? Evelyn.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel. I would say, first of all, I have to caveat everything I'm saying with the fact that I'm an optimist. I'm the child of Hungarian political refugees who fled communist Hungary to America to achieve the American dream, freedom and economic opportunity. And so I believe that that spirit that motivates so many Americans will prevail, and that we will overcome our differences and the crisis of democracy we're experiencing today. I don't know quite when, but I actually take some solace in the primary election results, which we just saw recently. So many of the states had primaries, which is to say within the parties, they had competitions as to who would be the candidate going forward in November. And the outcomes of some of those elections gave me a lot of hope, because we have some people who are moderates who have won, and I guess I'll leave it at that because I don't want to go on at length. I will say that I'm going to say a few things beyond your question, if that's okay, Pedro, or do you want me to hold it?
Please.
Okay, because what I find very interesting right now, so I do think there's a chance for the midterm elections first of all, I think that the Democrats will keep the Senate, largely because the Republicans have picked candidates who are not only extremist in the swing states, in the areas where there's real competition. They're not only extremist in terms of their politics, so far right within the Republican Party and getting Trump support, but they are also not good candidates for a multitude of reasons. They have personal issues and things of that nature. So I think the Senate will stay in Democratic hands, which will be good for President Biden. I think the House has a chance to stay in Democratic hands, but it's very close. And that's where I want to be cautious and not overstep my limited background analyzing U.S. electoral politics. Although, full disclosure, I did run for office once, but that does not make you an expert, especially if you lost. But I will say that there is a chance we Democrats could also keep the House. What I find most interesting, and maybe it's a tip towards your second question, so I will only just say, maybe I'll hold that part, but I did want to make a point about the presidential elections. I don't know if you're going to get to that later, but just very quickly, so the midterm elections are important because they will affect how our country will be governed until the presidential elections. The presidential elections, though, are really the most important thing because even if you have a Congress that's divided or in the hands of the other party, we've seen already that a president in the United States, whether it's Trump or before him Obama or Biden, can do a lot through executive powers in the United States. And so I'm not as concerned about the midterms as I am about the presidential election. And here I think it's very interesting because what we're seeing right now is that President Biden is setting up the midterm elections and then the presidential elections as elections of choice. He's bringing democracy to the fore, and again, we can talk about that in the global context, but he's bringing democracy to the fore, and he's trying to tell the American people that they have a choice. They can either pick candidates who are for freedom over your body, right, so abortion rights, freedom to love whomever you want, so rights for LGBTQ, freedom versus what the Republicans, especially on the far right, now that today's Trump Republican Party is offering, which is, full ban on abortion, potentially eroding the rights of men and women in America to love and marry whomever they like. So he's trying to set up this choice between freedom or this social agenda, frankly, that the Republicans have been offering. And so he's avoiding now, he's setting the stage to avoid a referendum on his policies, although he has also had success lately in terms of providing for his constituents, the people who voted for him, the things that they wanted. So he's made some he's had some legislative successes, and I'll be brief, I'm almost done. He passed legislation on the environment, on taxation, on a whole host of issues, and now I'm trying to rush because I don't want to monopolize the floor. But it has made an impact, and more importantly, the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, which essentially was the legal framework providing protection for women to have abortions under certain circumstances, that was overturned, and the result in a recent Wall Street Journal poll is that 83% of Democrats are likely to vote in November because of their fear of losing their freedoms versus 31% of Republicans. And 60% of American voters want some kind of legalized abortion. So certain restrictions around it, but some kind. Only 6% want a full ban, no abortions under any circumstances. So those are just a few, and I'm sorry, it was a little long, but opening comments.
No, please. I want you to feel free to just expound as much as you want, to think a little bit about that political landscape, what America is going to look like. I think, we fear very much, this ongoing polarization of our society, But I think that overall, and there was something recently, I think a recent poll that showed that both Democrats and Republicans are very afraid of the erosion of democracy in the United States. And as you said it, freedoms, but really what is that? It's democracy, it's democratic society, civil liberties, etc. So, Dan, your turn to predict the midterm elections and the political landscape.
These kinds of conferences are their own kind of war of attrition, and actually there's a lot of people here which suggest that all of you came to find out who's going to win the midterm elections and who's going to win the 2024 election, and I am delighted to be able to tell you. Of course, we don't know, and I guess I probably align with Evelyn, although I'm more pessimistic on holding on to the House, pessimistic from a Democrat's position on holding on to the House. And I do think that Americans are not prepared for what is going to follow if the Republicans take back the House, because I think there will be multiple impeachments of President Biden in the next 12 months after Republicans take over the House, and that will further cause chaos in our political system. But I want to take a step back and say two things, because I think it's very hard to predict what the outcomes will be in 2022, much less 2024. One is that the question I get usually from European friends in the transatlantic context is, we don't want to commit recommit fully to the relationship with the United States because we don't know what might happen next in your own domestic politics, and that feels very scary to us because we're burned by 2016. And the fact is, it doesn't matter what happens next in America. The right thing for Europe to do is to re-engage with America right now, because either you want to not waste this opportunity to build a partnership that is strong and that will protect the transatlantic community and the values we care about, or you want to lock us into a bunch of stuff that makes it harder for America to take a wrong turn down the path. And so in some sense, I don't think it matters as much as people think it matters what happens next in the United States in terms of deciding what the right policy is for Europe or for our partners beyond Europe. And the second thing is to connect it to the broader context to the discussion we had right after lunch about the West and the West being lost or having lost its groove or narrative or whatever. The United States is going through, in some ways, the United States, big as it is kind of a microcosm of that. We are going through an interesting moment where we are no longer triangulating against a previous dominant ideological regime. America used to be pretty solidly, 10 years ago, political commentators would rightly say America was a center-right country. Increasingly, it's kind of culturally center-right still, except for, obviously, the injection of some new social issues. Culturally center-right, but economically more center-left. Donald Trump played on that shift and rode it to election. And that makes it a very frothy, interesting environment, which we haven't settled yet on what the new kind of dominant regime will be for our politics. And I think that makes it incredibly hard to predict. The other thing that's going on, though, that is similar to the West more broadly is when I was growing up, I can remember riding to school with my dad and hearing on the radio, I must have been 10 or 11, somebody talking about family money. And I asked my dad, what is family money? And how do we get some? And he explained what family money was, and he said, the thing they say about family money is that the first generation makes it, the second generation keeps it, and the third generation loses it. And I think there's very much a political analog to that. The generation that saw World War II made the international system grounded in the liberal values that we treasure, built it through blood, sweat, and tears, and a lot of money. The second generation kept it, and the third generation has, in some sense, lost it. And it is up to us to answer the call as a new generation to figure out whether we can rebuild confidence in those values, both domestically in the United States and our democracy, and in partnership with others who are committed to those same values. So I think the American political kind of jumble is very much connected to the jumble that you see, where we see some of our partners some of our oldest partners disappointing us at times with their fidelity to the values that bind us together and that hold the most promise for our prosperity and freedom moving forward.
Dan. Randy, your turn. Predictions and what the landscape will look like.
Yep. So first of all, let me say I've been working in campaigns since I was very young. Both my parents were in elective office. I've worked 3 presidential campaigns, lost all 3, So take everything I say with a grain of salt. Second, just by way of contrast, when we talk about polarization, I want to make a point that should be obvious, but is, I think, too often not stated when talking about American politics. The over 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump for president are not all deplorable fascists. They represent very real concerns with the disappearing middle class, with the fading of the American dream, with increased costs for everything. And I think both parties ignore that at their peril. So let me do a little bit of the horse race for you, right? First midterms after a president is elected are always very, very difficult for the party in power. In 1994, Clinton lost 52 seats. In 2010, Obama lost 63 seats. That was the rise of the Tea Party. In 2018, Trump lost 40 seats. The one exception to that in recent history, you might notice I didn't mention George W. Bush. That's because of the September 11th effect on his first midterms. So going into this for the Democrats a couple of months ago, I would have said, you're going to see a red tsunami. Biden's approval rating was down. 70% of the country thought it was going in the wrong direction. Crime was up. Inflation was up. But now it looks like, at best, it's going to be a red puddle. And the reason I say that, and Evelyn mentioned some of this, there have been some legislative accomplishments. There have been the January 6th hearings, which have dimmed the star, at least in most people's minds, of some of the actions of the previous president in the waning days of his administration, and obviously the Dobbs decision on abortion. So the battle lines are drawn now for the fall. The Republicans want this to be a referendum election. They want it to be on gas and groceries. The Democrats want it to be a choice election. They want it to be on abortion and sedition. That is January 6th and the insurrection. So in the Senate, it really is too close to call. In fact, the Senate right now, to remind you if you don't know, is 50-50, nearly unprecedented. Evelyn's right. There's some pretty weak candidates on certain Republican, Republican states. We can go into them if anybody wants that level of detail. But there are also some weak Democratic incumbents as well. And I think whatever happens, now to the prediction, whatever happens, at most it will be a 52-48, more likely a 51-49. I can't tell you whether it's going to be Democrat or Republican. It won't have that much of an impact. All the majority leader can do in the Senate is set the agenda. There's only a couple of things you can pass with any regularity without 60 votes, and nobody's going to get anywhere near 60 votes in the fall election. In the House, I have to disagree a little bit with Evelyn, and I'll cite some impartial experts so you don't think I'm disagreeing just to be disagreeable. It's not all that close. It was going to be huge, like some of the numbers I gave you earlier. There's definitely been some tightening, but according to the Cook Political Report, which is a widely respected nonpartisan analysts of American politics, 10 to 20 seat gain they're projecting, and that's with all the recent changes. According to 538, Nate Silver's operation, there's a 76% chance Republicans will take the House. So I think they'll take the House. I think they only need 5 seats to take the House, and there's something like 45 Democrats that are elected in districts that Biden didn't win or won extremely narrowly. So it's a very rich playing field for Republicans, and you still have high inflation and all the things I talked about, despite the narrowing recently. So I think there's a far, far better than even chance that Republicans will take the House, and I have to agree with Dan. There's going to be an investigation of the investigation. That is, they've announced they're going to investigate the January 6th committee, so that'll be a spectacle if Kevin McCarthy becomes the speaker. Very safe bet they'll be moving on impeachment. And the other thing is, however many new members there are, and this will foreshadow a little bit, I think, of getting to foreign policy, these new members will be very Trumpian, if you will, not establishment. They'll be members more like Lauren Boebert from your state or Marjorie Taylor Greene rather than Mike McCall or Kevin McCarthy. And that's will be a further evidence of the Trump, what I call the Trump hostile takeover of the Republican Party, which is nearly complete, unfortunately.
Thank you, Randy. We could stay on this topic of the domestic front for the rest of the afternoon, but I do want to switch to the global dimension and see how the domestic impacts the U.S. on the global stage. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a U.S.-led unipolar world seemed like a foregone conclusion. But almost from the get-go, there was much debate about the long-term sustainability of that scenario. In 2008, the National Intelligence Council published a pretty hefty piece entitled Global Trends 2025, A Transformed World, which warned that during the next 2 decades, the US-led unipolar world would give way to a multipolar world of great power competition, of course citing Russia and China, and at that point, they were even considering India somehow appearing on that stage. So, Bill, you've been very patient. The question for you, is the US-led unipolar world waning? And are we seeing the coming of a multipolar world with great power competition that would be the US, China, Russia? Is this what's happening?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That said, what we see over the last 6 months, 7 months going on, is the role of the United States, the key role of the United States in this multipolar world. I'm sure we'll get into this, Pedro, but the United States has demonstrated that it can put together a coalition, a broad coalition, Western nations, not full, because it is a multipolar world, but an effective coalition that can lead the West in a major effect, in a major war, in a major effort to do something right here in Ukraine, right, on this one, and in Georgia. And let me just say, I'm very glad you didn't ask me to do any of the political stuff because I come from an organization that is nonpartisan, and I'm an independent. And the only reason I'm up here is because David Kramer needed somebody else in this seat. I'm absolutely sure that's true. But let me just say, I agree totally with Dan. That is what happens in the midterms, and I would even say, well, certainly in the midterms, that it doesn't really matter to foreign policy kinds of things, in particular on Ukraine. Because the support for Ukraine, as we will all talk about, is bipartisan. It always has been bipartisan. You talked about, since 1991. I worked on this thing with Ed Chow, and we put together assistance programs for the former Soviet Union, and it was always a bipartisan support that we would get to. Ed will agree, it's probably a fairly narrow bipartisan. Now, support for Ukraine is broadly bipartisan. It's broadly bipartisan. Yes, you have some extremes on the right and the left, but you've got support for Ukraine, and that's not going to change no matter what the outcome of the midterm elections, in my view.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Let's stay on this theme and hear from the others. Evelyn, your take on the global dimension, U.S. foreign policy.
Well, certainly in the near term, I would agree with Bill, nothing is going to change in terms of the overall trajectory. President Biden's been very clear, and this was the comment I was going to make, because the New York Times has an article out today basically saying that with this speech that President Biden made on the domestic context, on democracy in America, and trying to get this election of choice teed up for the midterms and then the presidency, he has now kind of brought his foreign policy and his domestic policy together. So the foreign policy always from the beginning of his administration was, we are democracy, we are fighting to defend democracy globally. We are fighting to enable those people all around the world who want to be members of democratic states. And that impulse, I think, will continue, and frankly, it's being strengthened, interestingly, not just by the situation with Russia, the war in Ukraine, but also, obviously, the Chinese foreign policy, which is aggressive rhetorically and also militarily, and increasingly fraught with tension when it comes to the US-China relationship. And in this case, not only is the support for being hawkish with regard to China bipartisan, but it's getting overheated a little bit, which means that President Biden will continue to focus on democracy versus autocracy, and Congress will continue to focus on that as well. It's, of course, risky when it gets overheated because there could be miscalculation, and I think that as we've already heard from colleagues on the earlier panel yesterday who talked about the fact that China and Russia are not the same. So I think it was Bobo Lo. You shouldn't confuse the two countries, their objectives, their trajectories, and your policy towards them. Nevertheless, I think that the interest in being tough in the China context will help President Biden continue to be engaged internationally, again, regardless of the far right and the far left. So I would agree, frankly, with my colleague.
Thank you. Dan, your
So
take.
I want to do two things. One, the multipolar world question. When I was ambassador to the OSCE, the Russians were always peddling this multipolar world talking point as a way of trying to elevate themselves. And the Russian ambassador would, Daniel, we live in a multipolar world. And finally I said, fine, I'll concede that we live in a multipolar world. What makes you think that Russia is one of the poles? Like, by definition, a pole attracts people to it. There's nothing attractive about the Russian model. And I'm not sure that there's actually anything attractive about any other model but our own. The Chinese have an enormous amount of power right now, but actually I think that there's a strong argument that maybe China has peaked in terms of its global power. That doesn't mean it's going away quickly, but that actually the next 10 years will not be as good as the last 10 years were for them. In fact, the most important lesson we might all be learning right now from Russia's behavior in Ukraine is what a declining global power looks like and how dangerous it is. And that's a lesson that we shouldn't, even though Russia and China are very different countries with very different contexts, the lessons about the danger of declining global powers is one that we shouldn't miss. But I think in some ways we're adjusting to a more complicated kind of strategic scenario where there's still arguably a unipolar world. There's only one country, one superpower that has an attractive model that is possible to share, but it's no longer hegemonic. And so how do you deal with a unipolar world where the unipolar country is no longer hegemonic is actually kind of the strategic challenge we're in. And I want to clarify a point I was making in my first comments. I do think it matters who wins the elections for US foreign policy. I think so far so good in terms of bipartisanship in supporting Ukraine, bipartisanship, and we've been lucky also that this has happened in the era of big numbers, coming after COVID. Congress was writing checks for $500 billion on a regular basis, and so writing checks for $50 billion for Ukraine didn't seem as big as it would have 3 years ago. And so it's been fortunate that the United States has been willing to step up in the way that we have, and I think that largely is a coincidence in many respects. But I think things could change. My point was that for Europeans who are wondering how they should engage with us, double down on the engagement now, because whatever happens next, that will be the right decision from a European perspective, is to double down on the engagement with the United States. But things could go wrong. I mean, we could end up with another America First, a bastardized version of America First foreign policy that de-emphasizes America's role in the world that is crucial right now. If we're not leading, then, I mean, that creates a vacuum, and you don't want to go down the list of who could possibly fill it. It's very depressing. And so I think things could get worse. Right now, we have been very fortunate that there has been broad bipartisan support, and it's actually unique in the American political landscape, arguably, right now, that how broad the bipartisan support has been. And I think giving one of the things international partners can do is recognize that they're continuing to pull their weight, France and Germany and the rest of Europe continuing to pull their weight is essential to the United States continuing to pull our weight in the future if we have political changes. And so it's really important, obviously, for its own reasons that Europe continues to do its part and actually needs to step up more. But it's also important in the way that it will shape U.S. behavior going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dan. Randy, please.
So I'll come back to Ukraine in a second, but I want to make a point that I think several of my colleagues may not appreciate. But we've had 3 presidents in a row that, for very different reasons, with very different styles, believe in a lesser American role in the world. In the Obama administration, Dan Twining mentioned yesterday nation building at home. It's the same thing that Rand Paul, who's a pro-Trump, semi-isolationist libertarian / Republican from Kentucky, says about nation building at home. There was no intervention in Syria. There was a withdrawal from Iraq. Trump, I mean, I don't have to give the laundry list to everybody. I mean, I guess in one sense he was multinational. He started a trade war with China, the EU, and Canada. The Biden administration started out with a withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then Ukraine landed. And yes, they deserve credit for building a strong coalition. Oh, I also want to mention that in the 2016 campaign, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump agreed on, as near as I can tell, just one thing, and that was to withdraw, don't support the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the multilateral trade deal in Asia that thankfully Shinzo Abe put together with no U.S. participation. The flavors of isolationism are in both parties, and I think the welcome bipartisan response to the Russian invasion and war of extermination against Ukraine has masked it a little bit, but I think we need to understand that. I mean, Bernie Sanders came this close to becoming the nominee in 2016 with Hillary Clinton as well, and he hardly was an advocate of a internationalist foreign policy. On Ukraine, I'm probably a little closer to Dan than Bill. I hope Bill is right. Certainly with the old Republican Party, Bill would have absolutely been right, but it's a new Republican Party. And of the votes against the Ukraine aid package, 57 in the House, 11 in the Senate, all Republicans. One Republican House member said, if we take the House, there'll be no more aid to Ukraine. Now, fortunately, he's not very credible. His name's Matt Gaetz. He's from Florida. He's under investigation from the FBI for trafficking 16 and 17-year-old girls to the Bahamas, so he may not be around. But that sentiment will be around. And also, very importantly, the Heritage Foundation, which for years was the bellwether of conservative political thought, really rose to prominence in the 1980s in the Reagan administration. The Heritage Foundation put out a memorandum to members urging a no vote on the Ukraine package. So the warning signs are there. Let me conclude on this, and it may seem cynical, but I've worked on Capitol Hill long enough to know how politics works. The best chance for continued bipartisan support, if the Republicans take the House, is if Kevin McCarthy, who will likely become Speaker, determines that he can make more political hay off of showing the Biden administration is weak on Ukraine and needs to be pushed harder and further. And that's the best chance in the nature of our politics in my view.
Thank you, Randy. I came across this interesting article. I don't know if I agree with it, but I want to bring it up to play devil's advocate. In Foreign Affairs by Michael Brenz and Van Jackson, July of this year. Great power competition is bad for democracy. Rivalry with China and Russia reinforces the real causes of American decline. And the argument that's made is that we put our attention on this competition and then we ignore things back home that create the cleavages, create the polarization. And they cite things from the Cold War. They argue that during the Cold War, we didn't really address, for example, race relations in the United States. That kind of was a victim of the Cold War. And even like in dealing with the global South, like I'm from Cuba, and I've always said Cuba was caught in history, was caught in the Cold War. it became this pawn between the United States and Russia. And you could say that about many countries in the global south, Latin America. The US would ignore countries if they thought that, okay, there's a right-wing government that's not going to bring in the communists. But things were not happening in those countries that was positive in any way. So what would you say about this commentary? Bill?
I'd say that if we had a choice, that would be one thing. We don't have a choice. General Ben Hodges has made the point that we have to do the homework at home. We have to build it at home. That doesn't mean we can avoid the competition, the work that we have to do to counter Putin and to compete with China. So we have to do both. So I would disagree.
Okay, Evelyn.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're making an isolationist argument, and it's this false dichotomy that I hear often also from people on the left, where they say, well, we shouldn't have this big defense department and this big defense budget. We should take all that money and put it towards food and education and addressing our domestic ills, and that's not the way the world works, as Bill was saying. The reality is you have to do both. You have to address your domestic problems and the international context, and just as humans are going to be competitive with one another, nation states are going to be competitive, and the only way that we keep other countries from, frankly, controlling our politics and taking away our freedom is to build a strong defense to deter them. And it's the same thing through our democracy. Our democracy can deter them as well, as can our economic might and our economic influence. So you have to figure out a smart way to do both. And I would say, on race relations, that was a weakness that we had that the Soviets actually exploited. There was a lot of, propaganda, but that wasn't actually propaganda. So it had a big kernel of truth, right? That they used to influence not necessarily Americans, but others who would be potentially attracted to democracy, to say, well, look at this democratic country and how they treat their citizens. They treat them still as if they were slaves today because they don't have the same rights, the same social justice as white Americans. And so because it was true, the Soviets were able to exploit it. So we have to be smarter today and recognize that some of the things that are being leveled at us, some of the disinformation, there's a kernel of truth in there. And so the kernel of truth that represents a weakness in our society needs to be, as much as possible, minimized or eliminated.
Great.
Pedro, can I just
Randy,
jump in
please.
on that? I don't know I don't know who those authors are. I don't know if they're from the Quisling Institute. I'm sorry, the Quincy Institute, or if they're from the left. But just a couple of quick points. The last time I checked, the Voting Rights Act passed in 1964, and I'm pretty sure that was at the height of the Cold War. Second point, yes, we allied ourselves with some pretty unsavory countries, but if you talk to South Koreans today or Filipinos today, under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, those countries, even though they were loyal allies, were pushed very hard, and rightly, to embrace democratic governments and to reject pro-American right-wing dictatorships.
Okay. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand the point. Everything that the United States, that the broad bipartisan consensus that within the United States has pursued in the last 75 years has been about avoiding a recession into great power competition. Yeah, we agree. Great power competition is bad because it leads to wars, which is why we have to stop Russia and Ukraine now, because it won't stop at Ukraine if that door is open. And so if the point is that a world in which we resign ourselves to perpetual great power competition is bad, we agree. That's why everybody keeps talking about a rules-based order, because that is the alternative to great power competition. And one of the things that makes the United States unique is its sustained commitment to that rules-based order, which, as many others have pointed out, is actually more important to small and medium-sized countries than it is to the ones who can defend themselves in a great power situation. And so I think I agree, it's bad. We should try to avoid it, and I think those of us who are fighting for liberal principles are trying to avoid it.
Great. Thanks. So I just got the signal from David Kramer that we are to open up the floor for questions from the audience. So quite a few. Okay. How about right here? Let's get a microphone. Oh, right there. And if you could identify yourselves, and please
thank
let's
you.
keep the questions brief so that we can get as many as possible.
Isabelle Lasserre from Le Figaro. The Figaro. I do understand that the support to Ukraine is transnational, but what will happen in 2024 if Trump is re-elected and if the war in Ukraine goes on?
Okay, very good question. Who'd like to?
Well, I want to, like Evelyn, be an optimist, so I'm not going to talk about 2024.
If you don't talk about it, it'll never come.
But in all seriousness, they're going to, if there's a number of things that have to happen for that scenario to come by, and that Trump would have to run again, and he would have to win the nomination, and he would have to win the general election. Those are all three big ifs. I was certainly wrong about Donald Trump and his political potential in 2015 and 2016, so I'm not going to make any predictions other than to say, if all three of those things happen, it will be an utter, unmitigated disaster. It will not be like Trump won. You will not have Kellys and Boltons and Mattises restraining the worst impulses. You will have guys like Stephen Miller are already identifying general counsels for all departments. It will be an utter, unmitigated disaster. But a whole number of things have to happen between now and then. And I certainly hope, yesterday somebody talked about, or no, it was the Cara from State Department talked about the ability of democracies to self-refine. I would hope we can self-correct, and think there's a good chance that will not happen.
Okay. Right here? Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Laura Thornton, GMF. So my question is related to, again, sort of looking ahead. And one of the concerning things I'm seeing at the state level are the number of election deniers that are getting elected into important state offices, secretaries of state, and even lower level offices, as well as state legislation that's putting on some restrictions on voting in several states, but also empowering election observation in dangerous ways. In addition, we're seeing threats against poll workers. I was just wondering, looking ahead to 2024, if you see these as potential obstacles to another debacle in terms of the results, in terms of slate of electors, and in terms of opening up the whole "I lost, ergo it was stolen."
Great
Thanks.
question. Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I'll just say very quickly that there was some legislation that was introduced, I believe, in the Senate, or was being negotiated, so probably was introduced, to address some of the weaknesses. And then there was more comprehensive voting rights legislation that was, I think, passed in the House, if I remember correctly. And see, I'm not really the expert, but, but I do know that there is still a desire within Congress, within this Congress, to address it. Now, whether they can do anything between now and the midterms, the answer to that is probably no. And then the question is whether there's something that can be done in the aftermath of the next set of elections, because they will probably, unfortunately, reveal continuing weaknesses and threats. And so the question will be, what can be done at that point to strengthen our electoral process going into the presidential election?
I mean, at the state level, it's a mess, and you're very right to be worried, and there's ongoing attempts to basically institutionalize and legalize the ability of individual officials to skew the intended outcomes of elections, where everybody who is eligible to vote is able to vote if they so choose. That is obviously something that is an ongoing problem, and there's not enough attention being focused on it, because it does undermine the credibility of our democracy, not only in terms of particular elections, but over the long run. So that's definitely an area that everybody should be seized with and worried about. At the federal level, the bipartisan attempt to revise and update the Electoral Count Act is about 120 8 years overdue, because in 1876, when we had the first time where we had 2 competitive slates of electors, and my home state of Colorado, because it had just become a state, didn't actually have an election that year, and the legislature assigned the 3 votes, and it was won by 1 vote, 1 electoral vote in the end, and it ended Reconstruction. We should have learned then that actually the system that we had wasn't good enough, and it wasn't tested again until 2020, and we obviously saw an attempt there to play with the electoral count. And the updating of Electoral Count Act for the presidential election is a really important piece of legislation that does actually safeguard against many of the tactics that were tried in 2020 and gratefully failed, but only just. So, you know, at the federal level, I think there's some good reason for optimism because of the bipartisan nature of that legislation.
Huge bipartisan support, and I think there's going to be an effort to get it done yet this fall.
Yes, before a new Congress. So that's good news. At the state level, it's as bad as you said it was, and worse, because we have to keep track of so many different places where that's happening.
Next question, Hiro.
Hiroakita from Nikkei. Please let me allow to ask a very journalistic question. But I'm not asking who's going to be a president because it is a fortune teller question. But my question is, what will be the possible worst nightmare scenario, both for Europe, Ukraine, and Taiwan and Asian allies after 2024?
Oh, excellent question. Who wants to take that one? Bill.
I missed the question.
What is the worst case scenario for Europe, Ukraine, Taiwan after 2024?
I think Randy has already answered that question.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders becomes president. I mean, they're both nightmare scenarios. And I think just a couple of words that if it's not Trump, I know there's a lot of worry, is it going to be a Trumpian candidate? I mean, of all the candidates that are either making moves or speculated about or whatever, would all have I believe, a very different view and a very different approach and style and set of priorities than Trump, including DeSantis, including Senator Rick Scott from Florida, a number of others that wouldn't be my preferred candidates, but they'd be, I believe, far better and far closer to what is a traditional Republican view. And on the Democratic side, the president says he's running again, so we know what's going to happen there, right?
Okay. Next question. How about right here, Basiki, and then we'll go to the back.
So very quickly, Trump will not be the next president of the United States, but DeSantis will be. What does it mean for Ukraine? And Randy, you've been wrong about predicting the presidents in the past, so maybe somebody else can answer the question.
We elected one president who had never served in the military and never served in the government. There's an awful lot of Republicans in line that have paid their dues and done the work well ahead of any of the Trump progeny. So I think they'd have something to say about whether one of them would be ahead of them in the presidency for 2024.
Okay. Let's go to the back. There's some hands up in the back. Bobo.
Yeah, thank you. Great panel, by the way. If the Republicans win the House, the Senate is a balance. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Ron DeSantis gets up as the Republican candidate, president-elect. How do you see the bipartisan consensus playing out on issues such as, say, climate policy?
Such as what? I'm sorry?
Climate policy, climate change.
Climate change.
Is there a bipartisan
one.
consensus on climate policy?
I'm talking about in general that you're making a case that there is a sort of overall a bipartisan consensus on US foreign policy. But clearly there are going to be issues where there are going to be major divisions. But how do you see policy playing out?
So Bobo, I think what's interesting about that, the subtext of that question is that one of the problems that the United States faces right now in our foreign policy in particular, but also in our domestic policy, is that we're unable to make long-term commitments. Because even though there has been bipartisan consensus on Ukraine for the last 7 months, we're not sure that that will last longer than the next election. There are a number of ways that that could fall apart. And in my lifetime, there were times where, whether it was right or wrong, everybody kind of had confidence that something that the United States committed to in foreign policy was going to be maybe less or more or less focused, but it was going to be a commitment of the United States going forward. And obviously there are other examples you can point to in recent times where the United States has pulled back from previous commitments. And I think it's not only that kind of credibility has been lost, but also our political polarization means that on an issue like climate change, where you obviously need to have a decades-long commitment to a strategy and a set of investments, and you can't do it for 2 years and then turn it on again for 2 years and have it come out the same way. And that's true of a bunch of foreign policy issues. I think that's a fundamental weakness of the United States right now in terms of our ability to navigate a long-term strategy where the United States, while declining in relative power because of the rise of China and other factors, remains the cooperator-in-chief for the world. We need to be able to be consistent and reliable, both in the way that we execute against a vision and the promises that we make to our partners in order to play that role of cooperator-in-chief. And that is a problem that we have right now.
Randy?
And look, there's a little bit of mythology about how there was this great bipartisan consensus on everything in the Cold War. Does anybody remember debates over Vietnam? And if you go to the missile gap in 1960, if you go to the 1980s, the huge debates we had over every Reagan weapons system, by the way, that then Senator Joe Biden voted against, the MX missile, the Strategic Defense Initiative, support for the anti-communist guerrillas in Nicaragua. So this golden age of we all got along and politics stopped at the water's edge is a little bit of wishful memory, if you will. But look, if you want a concrete example of bipartisan support, and I think Dan Twining mentioned it yesterday, when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were added to NATO, there were 19 votes against. When Finland and Sweden were added to NATO, there was 1 vote against. So there's huge bipartisan support for our enduring relationship with NATO and for our commitment to keeping the alliance enlargement door open to all countries that desire and qualify, and that includes, I hope, Ukraine and Georgia.
Okay. Right here, the gentleman over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Lagalushko, OSF. I have a question for you about the judicial branch. And I think the trends we see there, especially as kind of the Roberts Court is becoming the Clarence Court, and the decision on reproductive rights, I think there are huge concerns because these have repercussions on a lot of issues in the region, right? And this traditional agenda that Putin is pushing forward in Russia and in our countries against gender rights, against women, against LGBT, and against inclusion. So these same autocrats are turning around and saying, well, you know, they're doing it in America, so what's wrong with us doing the same here?
Okay. Thank you. Who'd like to?
I'm not sure I heard all. Can you just rephrase it? I'm not sure I heard all of it.
Asking about the judicial branch, you know, and these issues that are coming up.
The implications
reproductive
of
rights.
Dobbs, for Dobbs as a pretext for autocrats
exactly
pursuing their own cultural issues. I think it actually goes further than what you said, because for better or for worse, Roe was, in addition to the legal encoding of a right to abortion, it was also it was the keystone of the recognition of a right to privacy. And that has implications for how we manage digital, the digital transformation of the world, and how we respect individual rights to privacy in other contexts. And so I think one of the interesting questions is how this plays out in foreign policy and the ways that it gets brought up, not only by autocrats, but frankly, if I were in the EU Commission, I would probably bring it up in the context of negotiations over digital policy, because the United States jurisprudence around privacy has evolved since Roe to depend on the Roe decision as one of the ways that privacy is encoded into U.S. law. And obviously the implications for gender and bodily autonomy and stuff like that are also there, as you said, and can be used as a pretext by those who want to.
One last question, make it a good one. Nika.
Hello, Nick Alomidze, International Republican Institute. In the spirit of the McCain Institute hosting this and the leadership of McCain, I would like to get the panelists' opinion of someone from the opposing party that you don't support, that you see as potentially following McCain's legacy to lead, morally, strategically, so somebody from the opposing party that you're not a part of.
I'm happy to give you something from the
We have to each name somebody from the opposing party who we think follows McCain's principles
Yeah.
of leadership.
somebody, not something.
okay.
Somebody,
I'll go.
yeah.
I can name two, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. Sorry, I took away someone's name. That was not very team-spirited of me, I apologize. I'll just say Liz Cheney. I'll pick the woman.
And I don't have an opposing party.
Independent. Dan.
I mean, there are tens of millions of Americans in the opposing party who I think I agree with broadly on the same principles that I agreed with John McCain on when we traveled together. And, I mean, I guess I don't write off the 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump, even if I think that was not a vote that had America's best interests in mind, or was best for America. I don't think that they didn't have America's best interests in mind. So, I mean, my answer would be that there are tens of millions of Americans in the opposing party who are still able to be part of building a country together. And if we don't believe that, then we're more screwed than anybody has said we are. We have to believe that.
Yeah, I mean, that's easy. I'll name people either that I traveled with or John traveled with in senators. Joe Biden, who I went into Sarajevo in 1994 with Bob Dole when it was under siege from the Serbs, and we were fighting to enable the Bosnian people to defend themselves. Amy Klobuchar, Jean Shaheen. I mean, I could go on, but you get the point. There are a whole number of internationalist Democrats that I would be proud to support in their foreign policy aspirations.
I should have just said Randy.
Dan.
Okay, well, that wraps up the last panel of the conference. So thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you for a great moderating job. Yes, this is the end of a long 2 days. And to make this happen, we have a lot of people to thank, and I'll try not to spend more than 2 hours doing so. First, I actually want to thank this audience. The questions that you have asked, the fact that there are so many people here at the end of 2 days is a testament to the interest among Georgians in this kind of conference, and it's why I think this conference is so important. So thank you very much for your great participation in this. Second, of course, a conference wouldn't happen without the people who actually get on panels and speak. So I want to thank in particular not just our Georgian colleagues who participated, but those who flew quite a distance to come here and to be with you. And it's in part because this is a special place. And I think this is also a special conference, too. Sorry, my back is to you. I also want to thank a number of people without whom this wouldn't happen, the interpreters, for the job that they have done. The set designers, I've never been at a conference with a a 3D design right this. And outside too, absolutely phenomenal. The mic runners, the technical team, great job, guys. Thank you very much. Of course, the donors for this, and if I get this list wrong, Nino will hit me. It's NATO, the US Embassy, UK Aid, TBC Bank, OSF, and Konrad Adenauer and Ajara Group. And of course, our hosts here, the Stamba Hotel and the Rooms Hotel, for just a magnificent setting for this conference. Our huge thanks to all of those who make this possible. And then lastly, of course, thanks to the McCain Institute, Evelyn and Pedro is here somewhere. There he is, sorry. He's right in front of me. And the great team there, Paul and everyone back home in Washington. McCain Institute has been with this conference since the beginning. Thanks to Kurt also for his key role in making this partnership happen. But it goes without saying, I'm leaving the best for last, which is to thank the amazing team of EPRC and its heroic leadership by Nino Evgenidze. So for the people who have participated in the conference, we will have a dinner out here at 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock. Please be sure to show. It's always a special feature of this conference, the end of the conference dinner. To all of our Georgian friends, thanks very much for the, as always, tremendous hospitality. It's one of the reasons we love coming here. The Georgian people are so warm and friendly and welcoming to all of us. It is a privilege to visit your country, and we look forward to being back here again soon. Thank you very much.
If I may to add some short additional to this. First of all, thank you to David Kramer, because without him, none of this will happen. Thank you so much, David. Georgia doesn't have any better friends, you and some, more people, of course, together with you, who are participating in our conference now. And I'm pretty sure we're looking forward to see you here in next year and celebrate together the Ukraine's victory. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you.